to conclude chapter that we started already last week. It was nationalism and imperialism around the world. So we were talking last week. This was the last. Remember, we were talking about the unification of, basically, in the book talks about these two nations, Italy and Germany. They unified finally, and they, because the nationalism was aroused after Mr. Napoleon Bonaparte took over several places, several countries in Europe. So after that event, then the nationalism aroused, and then everybody wanted to have his own or its own country. So over here, the colonialism also was another, because remember during those days the industrial revolution needed natural resources in order to transform those resources in something useful. So all the factories needed materials. So they start looking for those materials, raw material, material crudo, o sea, la madera, grano, recursos que necesitaban para poder transformar ese material en algo físico necesario. Entonces, los diferentes países comenzaron a colonizar. Entonces, aquí en este mapa, in this map, they show you different places that different countries try to colonize around the world. Why? Because they needed this material, raw material, because during those days was the industrial revolution. So as you see, Belgium, Denmark, the red one, France, with color purple. Well, all this area belong to France, and also the Madagascar. It looks like Madagascar, another place over here. And now it's Great Britain, Inglaterra. As you see, they took over, or they tried to colonize India and some area in China, things, no, not in China, here in Australia, and over here in North America, okay? So all these were colonized of these countries, and this map shows you, okay? Now, colonial empire, have been, hay un micrófono abierto, por favor, apáguenlo, please. Apague el micrófono, gracias. Colonial empires, European nations have been building global empires since 1400. By the late 800s, the race of colonies grew heated. Germany and Italy changed Britain and France for territory. Japan modernized its economy and acquired colonies in East Asia. Japón, acuérdense, Japón invadió Corea y China. Y esas eran colonias de los japoneses. United States increased influence in Caribbean and Pacific. Now, the causes of the imperialism. Imperialism is the control of region or country by another country. A major cause was the industrialization, as I mentioned already. Needed raw material for the factories. Empires building in Africa and Asia. Africa became a major target of the imperialism power. Before 1880, European ruled only a few colonies in Africa, British, French, and other imperialists profited from mining operations and the operation of palm oil and other crops. África es un país muy rico en minerales, por eso que, como dice Francia, Inglaterra, dominaron ciertas áreas y usufructaron de los minerales, inclusive ahorita mismo también hay mucho mineral, de ahí se saca los famosos diamantes, de la película de Leonardo DiCaprio, Diamantes Sangrientos. Great Britain ruled over India and Burma. Russia expanded into Central Asia, France in Indonesia. Britain and France forced China to open the trade with terms that greatly favored Europeans. Now, Japanese imperialism. In 1853, United States sent a powerful naval force to Japan. Matthew Perry was sent to negotiate a treaty to open Japan to America. Que fueron a negociar la apertura de Japón, pero claro, ellos fueron con una armada naval para forzar a que los japoneses accediesen. So Japan greeted the Perry's turn, but Japan was determined to avoid foreigners' domination. Ellos no querían que fuese dominado por los norteamericanos. The country quickly industrialized its economy and built a strong army. Japan became an imperial power. Japan took Korea, Taiwan from China in 1895. 10 years later, Japan defeated Russia in a war that brought the Japanese more land. También lucharon contra los rusos. Now, this Japan wood block print shows the arrival of Commodore Perry in Edo Bay in 1853. Esto es cuando llegaron los norteamericanos a negociar con los japoneses. Imagínense, miren el barco que tenían los norteamericanos y los barquitos que tenían los japoneses. Así que ellos no iban a decir que no. No eran tan locos para decir que no. No iban a negociar con los norteamericanos. Okay. Let's move. So these are the areas that Japan, the Japanese empire dominates. All these areas: Manchuria, China, Korea, Philippines, New Guinea, some areas of Indonesia. All these were colonized and were part of the empire of Japan. Now, let's come to America. Yo estoy seguro que ustedes han escuchado la famosa doctrina Monroe. Esta doctrina dice, the Monroe Doctrine was the principle of United States policy originated by President James Monroe. James Monroe in 1823, that any intervention by external powers in the politics of Americas is a potentially hostile act against the United States. It is the best known United States policy toward the Western Hemisphere. En esta doctrina se dice que América para los americanos, o sea que no otro continente puede dominar una colonia en América. It says in 1840s, United States conquered nearly half of Mexico territory. In 1898, United States gained control of Philippines and Puerto Rico. Hawaii became territory of the United States. Como los demás imperios estaban conquistando ciertas áreas, Estados Unidos no se quedó atrás y comenzó a conquistar ciertas áreas. Le quitó terreno, el área que es California, Los Ángeles, todo eso le pertenecía a Arizona, le pertenecía a México y los norteamericanos se lo arrebataron. In 1903, the United States took over part of Panama and built the Canal of Panama. This is the end. Now, as conclusion, let's watch the video that I have over here for you about the colonies in the world and the other one that talks about Japanese empire. All right, so let's begin.
Here's something that comes up in the humanities a lot, and it's the whole notion and idea of colonialism. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about the history. Obviously, I have to a little bit. I'm going to talk more about the idea and what colonialism means. So what is colonialism? It's when you have a mother country that goes into another country and takes over. They want to get as much of the resources as they bloody well can, and they want to make use of the local population, either to turn them into its own citizens or to use them for labor. Very generally speaking, usually when we're talking about colonialism, we're talking about the European colonial period, which was roughly 1500 until the 1990s, although some people debate whether or not we're still in it right now. The example everyone always thinks of as a colonial power is Britain. The British Empire became the world's largest empire by going around the world and setting up colonies everywhere, from Australia to India, all over Africa, British Guiana and South America, and of course, Canada. Now, getting back to the idea of colonialism, it can basically be seen like a bad relationship. On the one hand, you've got this majority native population who is getting exploited mercilessly by the minority ruling class, a foreign power who is just going to take and take and take as much as it possibly can to feed its empire. Where this all gets complicated is during the Age of Discovery in the early 15th century, and even now, where you have competing colonial projects. It started out with Portugal and Spain sending out colonial projects, who eventually, of course, ran into the French and the British, everybody competing for different claims to land. Of course, you also had the native populations who just wanted to be left alone. So you had all these overlapping conflicts happening about who had a right to the land. But how do you justify a colonial project? Well, you write a lot of stuff down on a bunch of paper that says you're allowed to do it. Papal bulls are a perfect example. What that means is you get the Pope or someone else powerful to say that you can do it. Now, the way to expand an empire or a colonial project is usually through large-scale immigration or resource exploitation. You can see this all throughout the colonial period, where settlers were sent out to basically take over a giant piece of land. But you don't just set up a colony anywhere. You want to go where there's resources, things that are useful like coffee, bananas, sugar, wood. All of these different resources have shaped how colonial empires have decided to expand and also what kinds of labor demands they would need. Essentially, would they need slaves or not? One of the difficulties in maintaining a colonial project is that eventually you have the populations mixing, and it's very difficult to maintain this idea of a ruling class. Although, to some degree, I guess colonialism always exists because you always have some segment of the population ruling other segments of the population and deciding what the culture is going to look like. This was especially true in colonial projects in the Americas, where the idea of castas was developed. And depending on who mixed with who, they tried to develop these insane and complicated different racial categories. So if we're talking about colonialism as the definition of a relationship between a majority and a minority invader, we can consider that we probably still live in a colonial period, and certainly colonialism happens every day all around us, and there's been colonialism in some form throughout all of human history. I encourage you that when you're studying things in the arts and humanities to always consider how this relationship between the controlling foreign power and the people that exist natively in that culture, how those two interact, and how certain decisions are made based off of colonial ideas. Anyway, I hope that helps.
Okay, now let's watch the other one. As usual, this machine doesn't wanna.
What we're going to discuss in this video is the evolution of Japan from being one of the most isolated countries in the world during the Tokugawa shogunate to being the first Asian country to truly industrialize and become a world power. Historians will often categorize imperialism or colonialism in one of two categories. You have settler colonialism and economic colonialism. Settler colonialism is exemplified by the Americas, Australia, South Africa, where you have the empire sending people from their country to settle that territory, oftentimes displacing indigenous people and becoming the ruling class. Then you have economic colonialism, whose primary goal is to feed the purported needs of the Industrial Revolution. India and Indonesia are good examples of this. You're looking for raw materials to feed your increased productivity, and you're also looking for markets. And so in this context, as we think about the evolution of Japan from being extremely isolated to becoming an imperial power, think about which of these motivations was primary to Japan, or maybe was there a third motivation? Let's begin in the 19th century. Japan is in control of the Tokugawa shogunate, who has closed the country to foreigners. One of the purported reasons is fearing the influence of Christian missionaries as early as the 17th century. You have the British in India. You have the Spanish, who have been in the Philippines for several hundred years at this point. You have the Dutch in control of much of what will eventually be Indonesia. This orange color shows where the French already have a stronghold in Indochina and Southeast Asia. And in this peach color, this is what they would eventually control as we get into the latter half of the 19th century. But to really understand Japanese motivations in the 19th century, you have to think about what was happening in Qing China. As we talk about in the video on the Opium Wars, the British and other imperial powers want access to Chinese markets. The Europeans want Chinese porcelain and Chinese silk, but the Chinese weren't interested in trading with the Europeans. The Europeans, especially the British, eventually do find something the Chinese want, and that's opium, which is an addictive drug. It's the core ingredient in heroin and in morphine. The Chinese government, of course, does not want that opium inside the country. But as we talk about in previous videos, the British are able to force their way in with the First Opium War, often referred to as gunboat diplomacy. And after winning the First Opium War, the British are able to extract concessions from the Chinese, including opening up these ports. And even that does not satisfy the British. And so you have the Second Opium War from 1856 to 1860, after which opium, this addictive drug, is legalized. And to make matters worse for China, during the same period, they have an incredibly bloody civil war where over 20 million people die. Historians think in part due to the lack of confidence in the Qing dynasty because of the Opium Wars and the opium itself that is very destructive to society. Now, the Japanese were watching all this, and they also had their own interactions with the West. In 1853, the American Commodore Matthew Perry comes in with some of his ships into Edo Harbor, which is modern-day Tokyo, and is able to convince the Japanese to trade with the United States. The term convince should be used very carefully because, once again, this was a form of gunboat diplomacy. The Japanese saw the ships that Commodore Perry traveled with, and they knew what had happened during the First Opium War, and they were in no mood to have the same thing happen to them. Especially when Commodore Perry returned in 1854 with even more ships, the Japanese decided, why fight them? We will open up and allow some trade. And this is a very big deal. Remember, the Tokugawa shogunate had closed the country for over 200 years, but now they saw the writing on the wall. They could not defend themselves against the American warships. Like in China, these concessions in Japan to the Americans began to undermine trust in the Tokugawa shogunate. And to get a feel for what people were thinking in the mid-19th century in Japan, we have some quotations from Shimazu Nariakira, who was the daimyo of Satsuma, which is at the southern tip of Japan right over here. But he was considered to be a leading thinker of the time. And this photograph, it's not so clear, but this is believed to be the first photograph taken by a Japanese. It gives you a sense of the time that photography daguerreotypes were starting to be in use. It was inconceivable that China would deteriorate to such a degree. Remember, we're talking about the Opium Wars, we're talking about the Taiping Rebellion. With its vast territory and population, there could not have been a dearth of loyal and devoted patriots. Yet since the Opium War, its administration has been in disorder and ineffective. It has been
Okay guys, let's stop right here now. All this information is very interesting, but we don't have time. You have to go to another class. Then we'll see you next week. Remember, please complete all your activities, vocabulary, and assessment. Okay, because I might ask it for it maybe next week. I don't know. Who knows? Okay, bye. See you. See you tomorrow. I mean, see you next week, and have a nice week. Bye bye. Take care. See ya. Bye bye.